Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Watercolor Hour. Thank you for joining me. Today we're going to be painting these magnolias. I'm going to go over the items that you have in your kit. So you should have your paint set with 5 colors. You should have a scrap of watercolor paper. There may be a few where I forgot this, so I apologize in advance. Hopefully you have some at home. You should have your half sheet of watercolor paper, your outline for tracing, the reference photo. This month I also took some progress photos, so I included those as well. And you should have your round number 6 brush and a detail brush. You're going to want to grab some water, some paper towels, a pencil for tracing, and you may also want to grab a plate or a palette for mixing your colors. So the first thing you're going to do is trace the drawing. If you have a light box, that's usually what I use. You can also tape it up against a bright window and do it that way. I've seen people get creative and put lights inside of a big Tupperware container and then lay this on top. So get this traced, and I'm going to check out our colors here. So mine's a bit messy because I used this when I was making the sample and there's still paint on it, so I'm gonna keep using it. So first we have red violet. It's a pretty bright shade. Ultramarine, which I use a lot. We're going to be mixing these two. Sap green. Burnt sienna. And this says Van Dyke brown, but I actually ran out of Van Dyke brown, so this is burnt umber. It's just a cooler brown, so it's a little bit different from this one. We're going to use that on the branches. So I'm going to start by mixing a little bit of purple. So I'm just adding water in here. We want looking at the progress photos, we want our shades to be pretty light, so our paint's not going to be, completely covering this. We want a gradient of darker to lighter. So I'm gonna mix a lighter shade of purple as well as the pink. So I'm using the red violet, and this is really concentrated, so you don't need too much of it. And some of the ultramarine. And I'll see what this looks like. So that's a nice light shade. Now I'm going to make some light pink. Make a little more, so you just want to barely see the pink on your paper. Okay, so we're going to be jumping around a lot with this painting. I'll show you. One of the things we're going to be doing is, earlier, like I said, going from lighter to darker. So there are a couple of ways to do that. And we've done this before, but I'll go ahead and show you again. One way is to take your dark shade and then rinse off your brush and add water along the edge so that it kind of fades that way. You can also get a whole space wet, so if we were working on the painting, get the whole petal wet, and then grab some of your dark paint and put it here at the top. And I'm gonna dab my brush off there and then spread it this way. So this gives you, if you wet the paper first and then do this, it gives you a little bit more time to move the paint around. With this, you have to be kind of fast. One of the other differences is this is going to end up lighter because there's more water there. With this, you'll end up with a really dark shade that fades out. So for me, when I'm working with the petals, it's easier to do this, but I wanted to show you both ways. So we're going to be jumping around a bit. We're going to start with this petal here, and what I'm going to do is get the whole thing wet. My pencil lines are a bit dark just so you can see what we're doing. You may want to erase some of that before you get started, because once you paint over it, it's pretty hard to erase. Okay, so there's that one. I'm going to drop some of the purple down here. And some of the pink. So this is really light. And rinsing off my brush and just kind of dabbing the edge. So I want some darker paint here. So since these two are next to each other, I'm just gonna mix them here. And I'm going to add a little bit there at the bottom. And I'm looking at my reference photo, I can see a little bit of blue. So I'm going to grab some of this and put it in here. Add some more of my pink. So as long as the paper's wet, you can keep messing with these colors. Once it starts to dry off, you don't want to mess with it too much. If you want to add more color, you would wait until it's dry and then add more paint on top of that. Okay, so I'm fine with how this leaf looks. It's darker, fading into the lighter part. So now I'm going to work on this one down here. And I'm getting it wet. And for this one, I'm going to add a little bit of this purple down here, the light purple, and then I'm going to grab some of this pink. And if you have a palette, you can water it down in there. I just use the paper sometimes, but this is probably easier to see what you're doing. And I'm going to add some of the pink here. A little bit more of the purple. And again, this doesn't have to reach all the way to the top. These leaves are pretty light. If you want to drag some of this paint with your brush, you can, either using this brush or the smaller brush. So I'm gonna drag some to the center there. Now I'm going to work on this one. So for this one, I'm going to start up here because this petal is still wet. So I don't want to mess with it too much. If these two end up touching, the paint will bleed. Okay, so for this one, I'm gonna mix this and make a purple shade, kind of a dark purple. And add this here. And jumping around again, I'm going to add a layer of green to this leaf up here. So it's going to be a light green. And for that, I'm going to grab my smaller brush because I think it'll be easier. And just adding some water. So there's a little bit of green. And now finishing up the first part of the first reference photo, we're going to be filling in a couple of these little dark spaces. So right here, there's a little bit of light pink. So I'll fill that in there, and then here, looking for my pencil, I should have drawn a line here when I was tracing to kind of split this. Okay. Alright, so we're going to start with a layer of purple mix. And this mix has more pink than purple, or pink than blue, sorry. Okay, so it's just this little piece that's peeking out there. And then down here, there's a little purple spot. Right there. Okay, so now we're going to be moving on to this photo here. So this is still wet, so I'm not going to paint this one yet, but we can move on to this one over here. I'm just going to erase this, like an extra line or something. So for this one, I'm going to get this whole thing wet. And I'm going to need to change out my water here because my water's kind of pink, which is showing up on the leaves. And I'm going to take some of this purple here and add it to the bottom. I'm going to take a little bit of blue. I'm going to use this brush in here. Too much blue. If you put down too much paint, you can use a dry brush and pull it off. Alright, back to my purple. And I'm going to add some pink. So there's no right way to do this. Just a mix of blue, purple, or pink for all these petals, with the bottom being darker than the top edge. Okay, so that looks alright. And I'm going to work on this one here. And Oh, I forgot a little line. Alright, so for this one, I'm going to grab my small brush and I'm going to grab a pretty dark mix of purple. And fill this space in. So there's some pink, or the red violet shade. It's just a mix of pink and purple for this. And once this dries, we'll come back and do that other part. So over here, we're going to work on this one. Let's see, now this feels kind of wet. I'm going to work on this one right here. So I'm going to use this light purple mix here. And then this one has a line here. I don't know why I forgot all of those when I was tracing. And that will be the red violet or pink shade. And that's a bit dark, so I'm going to rinse my brush off and spread this out. Alright, so there's a little space I'm going to work on here, so the inside, and I'm going to use that same red violet, and I'm going to start darker here at the bottom. And rinse my brush off and get lighter towards the top. Let's see. I think the top is dry, so I'm going to work on this petal. And if you're looking here, it's mostly blue. And you don't want to get the whole thing wet. As you can see in the painting, we're going to come back with some pink later on. But since that area is darker, if this bleeds over, it's okay. This brush is too big, so. Grab some blue and just go along the edge. And my paper is pretty wet, so that'll spread out pretty well. So now we're going to work on this larger petal. We are going to need to be careful here because that's a little bit wet, but the edge of this petal is going to be pretty light, so we don't have to take our water all the way up. So I'm getting this wet, but avoiding this piece over here. And when you're getting down into these corners of the petal, it may be easier for you to switch over to this brush, because that size 6 is too big. And for this one, I'm just going to use the pink or the red violet here in the bottom. And because you don't want that to be super dark and fading into a very white area, I'm gonna grab some of this watered down pink I made earlier and just dab it on. And now I'm just blending. So most of this is gonna look white. Okay, so this is wet, so I can't work on this one quite yet, but I can work on this one here. So I'm gonna add some purple. So we're just adding this right here. Another missing line. Okay. So there's a mix of the purple and the red violet. There. Okay. So we need to work on this, but this is still wet. So I'm gonna jump up here, back to this one. So I'm going to take this light purple and fill this space in here. Okay, and I'm going to work on this. I'm going to get this whole leaf or petal wet. And I'm going to come in with the red violet here at the bottom. And if it's too dark, just rinse your brush off. And I'm going to grab some of this light pink, just like we did with the last leaf, and add it there. Okay, now we're going to jump over here to this leaf. I'm going to get some sap green. I'm going to add a little bit of burnt sienna. The sap green is really bright. And I'm going to fill that space in there. Okay, so this one is starting to dry off. So I'm going to work on this petal here. And I'm just going to put water in the center. And I'm going to put some of the red violet here at the bottom. And this is pretty dark, so I'm going to try to blend it out, just adding more water. This is still wet, so I'm just making sure that that area doesn't touch. Okay, one more thing to do here. We need a darker shade of green. But this is still wet, so what I'm going to do is work on the other side. So I've got sap green, I'm adding a little bit of burnt sienna, and I'm just going to go on this half and fill it in. And later on we'll work on the other half of that. Okay, now I'm just checking my reference to make sure I didn't skip anything. It looks like I forgot this little space here. So I'm gonna, too much water. Come here and just get this a little bit wet. And just use this faded purple mix here. And up here, I need to fill this space in. So I'm going to use the same, this light purple shade. And this is on dry paper. I'm going to add a little bit of blue. Okay, and then I'm going to come up here and just add a little bit of pink to this spot. Okay, so now I'm going to be working on this leaf in, or petal in here. So I'm getting it wet with my smaller brush just because this is a tight corner down here. And I'm going to grab some of the red violet and put it in here. So if you'll notice, the steps for a lot of this is, for each petal is pretty much the same. Get it wet, drop some color in, blend it out. So now I want some light blue in here. So I'm rinsing my brush off and spreading this out. Okay, so let's see, we've got this one. I'm going to start working on this one here. I'm going to go back to my big brush and just get this whole thing wet. And if your water's starting to look cloudy, definitely get some clean water. And so for this one, I want some purple, so I'm going to mix these two again. Need a little more of the red violet. So I'm just dropping this here. And I'm going to rinse my brush off and grab some of the red violet on its own and just mix it. And I'll grab some of this faded pink there. And if you're having trouble blending with your big brush, I usually will go back and forth, especially in these areas where there are corners. So now I'm just straightening out all these lines. Okay, so that one's done. I'm gonna grab some of this light pink from earlier and fill it in here. I'm going to work on this leaf over here. So this is still wet, so be careful with that. I'm going to grab, just like I did earlier with the sap green, and get some of the burnt sienna. So we just want to make the green a little bit darker. As you're painting, make sure that you don't get paint on your hand. I do that a lot, and then I end up rubbing paint all over my paper. Okay, so here, we're filling in the other half of the leaf, and we're just going to leave a little space there in the middle. So I'm going to start here. Rinse off my brush. Grab some of the darker paint again. And just fill this in. Now I'm making sure not to touch this because it's still wet, but if you want to wait till it's dry, that would probably be easier, but I'm just going to avoid touching that one. Okay, and I'm going to fill this in too with some of the sap green, but I want to make sure that it's lighter than this little piece over here. So I'm just rinsing off my brush. So because a couple of these petals are still wet, I'm going to start working on the stems and then come back and finish these up. So for your stems, I'm going to use the small brush because this big one is just a little bit too thick. So I'm going to start by getting this wet. Now I'm avoiding these little pieces here. There's one here as well because there's a tiny one here. Those are going to be green, so I don't want to paint them with brown paint. So I'm just filling the space in with water. It doesn't have to be perfect. We can fix it when we come back with the paint. And I'm going to grab some of this one here at the bottom. And you want it to be pretty dark because there's already water on the paper. So you want a little bit of water on your brush, mostly paint though. And we're going to just start dropping paint in. So you can see this is really concentrated brown. And I'm just going along the edge because I want the bottom to be a little bit darker. And I'm going to rinse off my brush and just blend this. So just to make sure that there's paint all over. And you can go back and forth between these two browns. So now I'm grabbing the burnt sienna. And I'm going to start working up here. And up here it's darker at the top, so I've got pretty concentrated brown on my brush. So you just don't want the branch here to all look like the same color brown. So that's why I'm kind of moving around and putting darker colors in different places. And here it's lighter, so I'm just going to fill this space in. And now I'm going to go up here, I'm going to take this one and start painting it on dry paper. So that's pretty dark, and then I'm going to rinse my brush off and just add water so it will get lighter towards the top here. And then I'm going to do the same thing down here. Still paint on my brush. I can get some of this wet. And then start dropping some of this dark paint in on this side. And rinsing off my brush. And going up here. And I want some darker paint down here, so I'm going to grab some of that one and just add it there. And there's a little dot here that I'm going around, but if you forget it to do that, it's not a big deal. And this up here is lighter, so I'm going to rinse off my brush and just push water around. And this here I want darker, so I'm adding dark paint. There. And I'm going to add some here. And I totally just covered that little dot I was trying to avoid, but that's okay. Okay, so there's our brown. And while we wait for these two to dry, I'm going to work on, oh look at that, I accidentally touched it. So, this is still wet, so I'm not going to mess with it. If I go in here and start adding paint, it's going to make weird lines. So I'm going to leave that alone for now, and I'm going to grab some green, and I'm going to paint a little space here. So some there, and then there's a little bud here. So I'm going to use some green there. I'm not painting the whole thing in green. What I'm going to do is come back with a little bit of brown. And so that'll kind of mix together. Now this looks like it's almost dry, so I'm going to work on this. I'm going to grab some of this brown here. I'm just going to mix these two, and I'm going to put some dark paint along the edge here. And then rinse off my brush and fill this space in. So you just want it to be obvious that all of these little parts are separate. And so the way you do that is to have some darker and some lighter. Okay, this looks dry, so I'm going to come down here and I'm just going to fill this in with brown paint on dry paper. And here, I'm gonna grab some green and paint half of this with this green color. And I have too much water on there, so I'm gonna grab some of that. And then there are a couple of little spots here that can be green, so I'm going to fill those spaces in. And that is these little pieces that are kind of hanging off the branch. And there's one here. And here. And for this one, I'm going to mix up some brown and green. So there's some brown there along the top, and then I'm going to come on the bottom with green. And there are a couple of spaces here to fill in, and I'm going to do that with some dark brown here, rinsing off my brush. And then here as well. And we'll leave this one kind of light. I'm actually going to suck some of this paint from there and put it over here. And then coming back here, this can be brown. And over here. Okay, so that's most of the branches. I need to come back and fix this later. So we're going to work on the petals that are left. So I'm going to grab clean water because now I've been mixing brown paint in my water. And work on this one here. So I'm going to get this wet. And use some of the red violet. I want it pretty dark because it's going to be down here. And I'm going to grab some of this lighter watered down pink and just drop it in here. And you can just dot it. And there's a little space here that we need to fill in. So I'm going to grab some of the red violet. And again, just putting it in the bottom here, and then rinsing off my brush and blending it. And again, this is wet, so I'm just gonna avoid that for now. Alright, and this one has a little bit of purple. So I'm grabbing my mix of red violet and ultramarine, the watery mix, and putting it here. And rinsing off my brush and just blending this. Make it a little bit darker. And that is red violet. And if you put too much paint, just soak some of it up. Okay, so now I'm looking over to make sure I didn't skip any of the petals. And I've got a little bit of space that I need to fill in here. So along the edge here, it's a different shade, so I'm going to fill those spaces in. And with this one, I'm just going to grab some red violet and add it here at the bottom. And then rinse off my brush and drag this. Now be careful, if this little green space is wet here, you don't want to touch it. You may want to wait for this to dry. And going around to the top. And over here, I'm just going to add some lighter pink. We don't want it to be the same shade as this other section. So the last part is the easiest part. All we're going to be doing is adding our lines. So all of these lines here, which in our painting are a little bit dark. In the reference photo you can see they're pretty light, so if you want to look at this and make them lighter, you can. I'm mostly just going to use the red violet here, but it's going to be watered down. It's not going to be straight from this card. So it's pretty dark, but not as dark as if I just swiped a barely wet brush across this. Okay, so we're going to start with a thicker line. So in the line drawing that we traced, you can see here I added some of the lines in pencil, so I'm just going to follow along there. So just use your brush, and when you're doing lines, it's easier to hold the brush at this angle instead of like this, so at 90 degrees. Okay, so there's one. A little bit darker. And if your lines are too thick, you may just have too much water on your brush, so just dry your brush off and start over. As long as the paint hasn't been there too long, you should be able to just put a paper towel over it and pick some of that up. Okay, now we're up here. I keep accidentally putting my brush there. I don't know why. Right here. And then over here, I'm going to add some as well. And this one. And over here. Alright, so those are the kind of the thicker lines. Now I'm going to work on some of these thinner ones. So for that, the paint needs to be a little bit lighter. So I'm going to add just a little more water to this. Okay, and I'm just going to follow along these thicker lines and make some thinner ones. And the lines don't all have to be connected. This one. can do as many of these as you want. You can also just leave them off entirely. It's up to you. Here. So mine's still a little bit wet, but we wait for this to dry. And then you can add your line in the middle there. Okay. So that is it. I messed up, so I'm gonna add some brown here just to fix it, and we'll just make this whole thing thicker. And this is just water. Alright, so there is your finished painting. I know this one had a lot of details and a lot of jumping back and forth. So botanical paintings can be kind of tedious, but if you have some time to do it, they're a lot of fun, I think. Thank you for joining me for Watercolor Hour. Next month we're going to be painting the moon, so something much less detailed and a bit easier. So I hope you'll join me for that. Registration opens on March 11th for next month's Watercolor Hour. Have a good weekend. I'll see you next time.